They say the battlefield never forgets. The soil remembers every drop of blood it drinks, every scream that fades into the smoke, and every soldier who never made it home. When the wind blows over the ruins of forgotten wars, it carries whispers of men who died once and never stopped marching. Winter of 1944. The war was entering its final, desperate months. The Allies were pushing through France toward Germany, and the once green countryside had turned into a graveyard of iron and bones. Amid this chaos, a British reconnaissance unit in the 8th Infantry Regiment was assigned to secure a small abandoned village near the Ardennes forest. The map called it Ravensbrück, but the locals had another name for it, the Valley of Shadows. Before you continue this story, make sure to like and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a heartbeat of those who never returned home, but never stopped fighting. Captain William Harrow led the unit, 36 years old, war-hardened, face carved by sleepless nights. His men trusted him, though they knew he carried something heavy behind his eyes, something he never spoke of. As the convoy rolled through the foggy road leading into the village, the radio crackled with distant interference. The operator swore he could hear faint whispers in German, though no enemy was nearby. The village appeared out of the mist like a memory, houses shattered by shell fire, a church bell hanging crooked, and snow falling softly over corpses frozen in surrender. The men moved silently. Even the sound of boots crunching snow seemed too loud for this place. Harrow raised his hand, signaling to halt. "This isn't right," he muttered. "It's too quiet." They split into two teams. One swept the church, the other secured the old schoolhouse. Inside the church, Private Ellis found rows of pews burned black, the altar cracked open by mortar fire. But what froze him wasn't the destruction. It was the faint sound of a hymn, soft, distant, feminine. Yet the church was empty. Ellis called out, "Sir, I think someone's here." Harrow entered, rifle raised. The sound stopped. Only the echo of his own breath remained. When he turned toward the altar, he saw something half buried in ash, a small silver locket. Inside was a photograph of a German nurse and a child. The image was charred, but their eyes remained, haunting, alive. That night, the regiment made camp inside the schoolhouse. The wind outside howled like dying men. Private Langley, the youngest in the squad, swore he saw figures moving through the fog, outlines of soldiers walking without sound, faces pale and hollow. "Probably nerves," Sergeant Cole said, lighting his cigarette. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness outside wasn't empty. Around midnight, Harrow heard it too, faint footsteps circling the building. He loaded his pistol and moved quietly to the window. Through the shattered glass he saw them, a group of soldiers in German uniforms standing motionless near the playground, rifles in hand, staring directly at him. Their faces were grey, their eyes black voids. Before he could react, lightning flashed, and they were gone. The next morning they found tracks in the snow, bare footprints, no boots, and they led straight into the forest. The men grew restless. Radios malfunctioned, food tasted of ash. The air smelled of gunpowder, though no battle had been fought here for months. Harrow tried to keep discipline, but his own dreams began to unravel. Every night he saw the same vision, a nurse standing in the church, whispering, "You left them here." On the fourth day, the unit received orders to move deeper into the forest, to locate an old German bunker, rumored to store vital intelligence documents. The path was narrow and silent. Not even birds dared to sing. As they moved deeper, the trees began to change, tall, skeletal, their bark marked with bullet holes. And there, half buried under snow, they found helmets, bones, and shattered rifles, the remains of men long dead. Private Langley's voice trembled. "Sir, look at this." He pointed to a rusted dog tag hanging from a branch. Harrow wiped the snow off. His heart froze. It read Harrow W., 8th Infantry, his own name. For a long moment no one spoke. The forest seemed to close in. Then the radio operator shouted, "Movement!" 12 o'clock. Figures emerged between the trees. Soldiers, dozens of them, advancing silently through the mist. Their uniforms were tattered, faces unrecognizable, eyes hollow. The living aimed their rifles, hands shaking. But when the fog thinned, the figures disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of marching boots fading into the distance. Night fell again, colder than before. The men huddled in the bunker they finally discovered, a damp, suffocating tomb of concrete and shadow. Inside were relics of the past, rusted helmets, torn flags, frozen corpses still gripping their rifles. Harrow ordered the men to rest, but no one slept. The sound of dripping water mixed with something else, faint whispers, in German, in English, in languages none of them recognized. At 2 a.m. the generator failed. Darkness swallowed the bunker whole, and in that silence Private Ellis began to scream. When they lit their lanterns, he was gone. Only his rifle remained, and a trail of wet footprints leading deeper into the tunnels below. Harrow and 2 men followed. The tunnels twisted like veins beneath the earth. At the end of the passage, they found a door marked with the Nazi eagle. Harrow kicked it open and froze. Inside was a large room lined with corpses, preserved by the cold. But these weren't German soldiers. They were British, his men. Each body had a bullet hole in the skull, execution style, and among them was Ellis. But his eyes were open. He whispered, "You left us here, Captain." Harrow stumbled back, trembling. The other men fired their rifles, but the bullets vanished into the air like smoke through a dream. The corpses began to rise slowly, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The lantern flickered, then died. The screams echoed through the tunnel and up into the forest, swallowed by the night. At dawn, only Harrow emerged. His uniform was torn, his face pale as chalk. He walked aimlessly through the snow, whispering names. When the rescue unit found him 2 days later, he was sitting beside the church ruins holding the silver locket. Inside, the photograph had changed. It now showed Harrow himself standing beside the nurse. He was the only survivor. When questioned, Harrow refused to speak. The official report called it combat stress and exposure. Ravensbrück was abandoned, erased from maps. But locals say that when the fog returns to that valley, you can still hear the distant sound of boots marching through the snow. Men who never stopped fighting, led by a captain who no longer knows he's dead. Snow still covered the valley when Captain William Harrow was sent back to England. The official medical report called it extreme psychological trauma due to isolation and exposure. But among the soldiers who carried him out of Ravensbrück, no one forgot what they saw that morning. Harrow didn't resist. He didn't blink. He simply walked beside them like a shadow, whispering names they didn't recognize. And when they crossed the forest line, he turned back once and toward the mist, as if something was still calling him from within. He was hospitalized in a military asylum near Dover, in an old estate turned into a rehabilitation center for war fatigue. Dozens of soldiers filled its corridors, men who had seen too much, heard too much or forgotten who they were. But Harrow was different. He refused to speak. For weeks, doctors tried to reach him. Hypnosis, medication, memory therapy. Nothing worked. The only thing he reacted to was the sound of church bells. Whenever the chapel bell rang in the morning, Harrow would flinch, close his eyes and whisper, "She's calling them again." Dr. Margaret Holloway was assigned to his case, a young psychiatrist who had spent years studying the mental toll of war. Her notes described Harrow as highly intelligent, deeply haunted and trapped between guilt and disbelief. During her first session, she asked, "Captain Harrow, do you remember where you are?" He nodded slowly. "Safe," he said. "But they aren't. Who?" she asked. "The ones I left behind," he replied, voice trembling. "The ones who don't know they're dead." Dr. Holloway noted the phrase. It would repeat across all their sessions. Over the next months, she began piecing together his story, fragment by fragment, the night patrols, the whispers, the bunker of corpses, the locket. But there was one part Harrow refused to talk about, the voice. Whenever she mentioned it, his heartbeat spiked, and his eyes darted to the window, as if expecting someone outside. And once, in a quiet session, he finally said, "She was there before we arrived. The nurse, she wasn't human." By the summer of 1945, the war was officially over. Europe was rebuilding. But Harrow's mind remained trapped in the snow-covered ruins of Ravensbrück. Dr. Holloway requested permission to visit the site, hoping to confirm whether his delusions were born of trauma or rooted in something real. The army reluctantly agreed. So 3 months later, she travelled to northern France carrying Harrow's notes and the locket recovered from the church. The village was gone. Only the church's bell tower still stood, cracked in half, surrounded by rusted helmets and weeds. Local farmers warned her not to go near the forest. "Bad air," they said. "People go missing." But she went anyway. The air grew colder as she walked. Snowflakes began to fall, though it was September. And somewhere deep among the trees, she heard faint music, the same hymn Harrow had described in his reports. She followed the sound until she reached the old bunker, half buried under moss and earth. The door was sealed shut by rust, but she managed to pry it open. Inside, it was exactly as Harrow had said: frozen relics, rusted steel, and silence so heavy it felt alive. Her flashlight flickered across the walls. Bullet holes, bloodstains, words scratched into the concrete: "Forgive us," and below it in faint red letters, "Harrow." Dr. Holloway stumbled back, gasping. She turned to leave, but in the distance she saw a flicker of movement. A soldier, British uniform. Helmet slightly tilted. He stood motionless, watching her from the other end of the corridor. She froze. "Who's there?" No answer. She took a step closer, and the soldier slowly turned, walking into the dark. She followed, heart pounding, until the light caught his face for a second. It wasn't a man. It was a shadow wearing a uniform, empty eyes glowing faint blue beneath the helmet. Her flashlight died. She ran. When she finally stumbled out of the bunker, the snow had stopped. The forest was silent again. But when she looked down, her boots were leaving bare footprints. Back in England, Harrow sensed the change before anyone told him. He woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering her name: Margaret. The nurse on duty wrote that his pulse was erratic, his breathing shallow, and his pupils dilated, as if he were seeing something in the room that wasn't there. The next morning, the radio in the ward, which hadn't worked in months, began playing faint static. And through it, someone's voice said, "We're still waiting, Captain." That same day, the army received word from France Dr. Holloway had gone missing near Ravensbrück. Search teams found her journal near the church ruins. Inside, her last entry read, "The voices aren't hallucinations. They're echoes. The battlefield is still alive with them. Harrow wasn't delusional. He was chosen." After that, Harrow was moved to a higher security ward. But something strange began happening in the asylum. Nurses reported seeing soldiers wandering the hallways at night, uniforms from different wars, faces pale and silent. Lights flickered in empty rooms. And on stormy nights, the chapel bell rang by itself. Every time it did, Harrow smiled faintly and whispered, "They've found her." The asylum staff grew uneasy. One nurse resigned after claiming she saw footprints made of ash leading to Harrow's door. Another swore she heard singing from inside his room, a woman's voice, humming the same tune that echoed in Ravensbrück. No one could explain how the air inside his ward grew colder than the rest of the building, or why mirrors near him fogged over with faint outlines of faces. Harrow didn't resist the haunting. He began writing letters, dozens of them, addressed to names no one recognized: Ellis, Langley, Cole, all soldiers from his lost unit. In every letter, he wrote the same line: "I'm coming back. Wait for me." Winter returned. The snow outside Dover fell heavier than anyone had seen in years. On the night of December 17, 1945, a power outage hit the entire asylum. When the lights returned 2 hours later, Harrow's cell was empty. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. Only a set of muddy footprints leading from his bed to the window, and outside, across the snow, those same bare footprints leading toward the sea. The investigation concluded nothing, but 3 days later, a French fisherman near Calais reported seeing something strange along the coast. A man in a tattered British uniform, walking alone along the shore, carrying what looked like a small silver locket. When the fisherman called out, the man turned, and pale face, hollow eyes, and vanished into the fog. Years passed. The war faded into history. The asylum was shut down in the 1960s, condemned as unsafe. But locals say the bell tower still stands, and sometimes when the wind blows over Dover cliffs, you can hear the faint echo of marching boots. Some claim they've seen the figure of a soldier standing at the edge of the ruins, staring toward the sea as if waiting for a call that never comes. One winter morning in 1978, an old groundskeeper cleaning the property found a rusted box buried near the chapel. Inside were dozens of letters, all signed Captain W. Harrow. But the final one was different. It was written in a woman's hand. It said, "The dead don't rest where they fell. They follow the living who remember them." Monsieur Holloway, military historians later debated the legend of Ravensbrück. Some dismissed it as folklore, another ghost story born from the trauma of war, but others, especially soldiers who fought in the same region, swore they felt something unnatural there, a weight in the air, a presence watching from the trees. And more than once, patrols reported hearing phantom gunfire echoing through the fog at night, though no enemy was ever found. In 1983, a BBC documentary crew tried to film at the site for a war history special. The footage was never aired. What they captured instead was silence, static, blurred images, and one frame where a figure stood among the ruins, face half visible through the mist. The technicians swore it wasn't any of the crew. When they enhanced the image, they saw the shape of a soldier, and beside him a woman in a nurse's uniform, both staring directly into the camera. The original footage was sealed by the network, but years later, leaked clips appeared on underground forums, labeled the Ravensbrück recording. Experts who analyzed the sound confirmed something chilling. Underneath the static, faintly a voice could be heard whispering, "You left them here, Captain." By now, Ravensbrück is gone, swallowed by time, renamed, rebuilt. But travelers still say that on certain nights when the fog crawls down from the hills, the snow turns red for a few minutes, and if you stand where the old church once was, you might hear the sound of marching, not from this century, not from this side of life, somewhere out there. The ghosts of the battlefield are still marching, not for revenge, not for peace, but because the war never truly ended for them. It only changed form, and among them walks a captain and a nurse, side by side through eternity, carrying the memory of men who died twice, once on the battlefield, and again in history's silence. Q. The valley slept beneath a new century, but the ghosts did not. By 1993, Ravensbrück had become nothing more than coordinates on forgotten military maps, swallowed by pines, moss and snow. The world had moved on, the old front lines erased, the silence rebranded as peace. But sometimes, peace is only what remains when the noise dies. That year, an American historian named Dr. Samuel Reed arrived in northern France, researching a book on unrecorded battles of World War II. He had read about a classified file once stored in British archives, a missing regiment, a deranged captain, a psychiatrist who vanished. The file was marked Harrow Incident, Red Classified, officially sealed for 50 years. Reed, a skeptic and rationalist, believed every ghost story hid a human truth. Guilt, trauma, memory, but Ravensbrück felt different. Even before he arrived, locals warned him. The driver who brought him from Calais refused to enter the forest. "People hear voices there," he said in a low tone. "And the ground, it moves when you walk on it." Reed laughed, thinking it was superstition. But by the time he reached the valley, his laughter had frozen in the air. The forest greeted him with silence so deep it felt alive. Snow fell gently through the black branches, coating the ruins in silver dust. Where the church once stood was now a circle of charred stones, and beneath them, a single cracked gravestone with no name. Reed unpacked his recorder. "Ravensbrück," he spoke softly into the mic, "coordinates 54 north, 4 east. Location of the alleged Harrow incident. Entering the perimeter." The tape hissed faintly, and then a sound deep in the static. A whisper. Just one word. "Welcome." Reed shook his head, thinking it was feedback. He continued. He had come to verify whether any trace of the 8th Infantry Regiment still existed. Documents, remains proof. According to archives, the regiment disappeared in January 1944. No bodies ever recovered. But in his interviews, Reed had found villagers who swore they'd seen soldiers wandering the valley after the war, some even decades later. One old woman told him They march when the moon hides, always toward the church, never beyond. Another said the captain leads them, but he doesn't cast a shadow. Reed dismissed it as folklore, yet part of him wanted it to be real, because if it wasn't, then how could so many remember what never existed? As he explored the ruins, he found remnants of uniforms, shell casings, rusted rifles half swallowed by earth. But near the edge of the forest, something stranger, a chain of dog tags fused together by heat, as if they had melted in fire. He wiped the frost off one tag. It read, Cole S., 8th Infantry. Another, Langley P., Kill Infantry, and then one more half-buried, Harrow W., his breath caught. How? He whispered. How can... Before he could finish, the air shifted. The forest grew darker, the snow stopped falling, and from somewhere beyond the trees came the faint rhythm of marching boots. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Reed's heart pounded as he lifted his recorder. Is someone there? No answer. Only the sound of synchronized steps drawing closer, and then fading away. He followed the trail into the fog, deeper into the forest, until he reached a clearing. There, half submerged in ice, was the old bunker. It was exactly as Harrow had described decades earlier, concrete walls cracked by time, the entrance sealed with frost. He pried open the door and descended into darkness, flashlight trembling in his hand. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The beam of light cut through layers of dust and frost, revealing a corridor lined with rusted helmets and frozen puddles. He walked slowly, recorder running, muttering observations. But the deeper he went, the more he felt it, pressure like a heartbeat in the walls. The silence wasn't absence, it was attention. At the far end of the tunnel, he found a room, and on the wall, faint letters carved by trembling hands. Forgive us. Captain. Below it, pinned to the concrete by a rusted knife, was a page from a field journal. Reed pulled it free. The paper crumbled in his hand, but one sentence was still legible. We buried them under snow. The nurse said it would keep them quiet. He froze. The nurse. The same one Harrow had described. He whispered into the recorder. Possible German field medic involved in post-battle executions, and then stopped, because from behind him came a voice, soft, clear, female. Captain Harrow? Reed turned. No one was there, but on the wall, the frost began to melt, dripping downward to form the faint shape of a woman's silhouette. Her voice again, echoing softly. You came back. The flashlight flickered. Reed stumbled backward, gasping, but his recorder still captured her voice. It wasn't an echo. It was a whisper carried through time. When Reed returned to his hotel that night, he locked himself in and replayed the tape. Through the static, he heard his own voice, and underneath it, dozens of others whispering at once, names, numbers, prayers, and finally, the same voice saying, he's waiting. He couldn't sleep. That night, he dreamed of snow. He was standing in the valley again, surrounded by soldiers with pale faces. They were staring at him silently, rifles pointed at the ground. Then one of them stepped forward. A tall man, eyes empty, uniform in tatters. On his chest, the insignia of the 8th Infantry Regiment. The man spoke. You shouldn't have come here. Reed woke, screaming, drenched in sweat, the sound of marching still echoing faintly in his ears. He packed his bags at dawn and left Ravensbrück behind, but the recording, he kept it. He told himself it was for research. But deep down he couldn't let go of that voice. 3 months later, Reed presented his findings at a historical symposium in London. He played the recording publicly for the first time. At first, the audience laughed. Ghost tape, they called it. But when the voice said, he's waiting, several people in the crowd visibly shivered. A war veteran stood up midway through and left the hall, muttering, that voice, I've heard it before. To 1944, Ardennes. After the presentation, a grey-haired man approached Reed privately. He introduced himself as Colonel Henry Mason, retired intelligence officer. He said quietly, You found the valley. Reed frowned. You know about Ravensbrück? Mason nodded. I was part of the cleanup team after the war. We were told to burn everything, erase it, but we didn't. We buried it. He handed Reed an old photograph. Faded, torn, it showed a group of soldiers standing before a bunker. In the center, Captain Harrow. Beside him, a woman in a nurse's uniform. On the back of the photo, a date January 16th, 1944, and a note. She brought them back. Mason told him the truth, or at least the part he knew. During the retreat through the Ardennes, Harrow's regiment had encountered a German field medic named Elsa Weber. She had stayed behind to tend to the wounded after her unit was wiped out. Witnesses claimed she spoke to the dying, promised them peace, and then, one by one, they stopped breathing quietly, almost willingly. When Harrow's men found her days later, she was tending to both Allied and German corpses, humming hymns softly under her breath. Something about her unsettled the soldiers. Some swore she never blinked. Others said her shadow moved before she did. But Harrow, already exhausted, desperate for order in chaos, trusted her. He let her guide them through the valley. Where she said there was shelter, that was the bunker, and that was where everything ended. She wasn't human, Mason said quietly. We never found her body, but every time we opened that bunker after the war, the corpses looked fresh, like they'd just fallen. Reed stared at him. And Harrow? Mason exhaled. We buried an empty coffin. Reed left the meeting shaken. He wanted to walk away, to close his notes, destroy the tape, forget the whispers. But one night, curiosity won. He played the recording again, headphones on, volume full. This time, he noticed something he hadn't before. Underneath the whispers, faintly, breathing, not his. Not the soldiers, a woman's breath, rhythmic, calm, and then almost inaudible. Come home. Captain. He paused the tape. The room was silent, except for a faint knock at the door. 3 slow knocks. He opened it. No one there. But on the hallway floor lay a small envelope, unmarked. Inside, a silver locket. He froze. The same one described in the Harrow file. He opened it slowly. Inside was a new photograph, Harrow, the nurse, and between them, Thomas Dr. Samuel Reed. They found his hotel room empty the next morning, the bed untouched, window open, snow drifting in. On the desk lay his recorder, still running. The last entry captured 10 seconds of silence. And then, faintly, the sound of marching boots. The recording was seized by British intelligence and locked away again, filed under the same classification as before. Harrow incident, Red Tit 2. 70 years later, the file remains sealed. Today, the forest of Ravensbrück is fenced off, restricted as an environmental hazard zone. No tourists allowed, but satellite images show faint patterns in the snow, circular trails, like footprints repeating in perfect formation. Locals near the area still hear faint hymns on cold nights, and some hikers who've strayed too close claim they've seen a man in uniform standing among the trees, watching. Sometimes he vanishes, sometimes he speaks. A French photographer once captured a picture in 2016. It showed a figure in a fog-covered field, back turned, holding a locket. When digital experts enhanced the image, they found something impossible, the reflection of a woman's face in the locket's glass. She was smiling. Historians now call it the Harrow phenomenon, the strange intersection of memory, guilt and haunting on old war grounds. But those who've studied the tapes, the photos and the testimonies quietly admit, none of it explains the whispers. None of it explains why. During the annual snowfalls, the soil at Ravensbrück still trembles like marching feet beneath the earth. They say the battlefield remembers. It remembers the dying and the killers, the guilty and the innocent. And it remembers those who returned when they shouldn't have. The war ended, but the dead never stopped obeying orders. They march night after night through a valley of echoes, led by a man who no longer knows he's a ghost, and a nurse who never lived at all. And if you listen closely, when the wind shifts and the snow falls sideways, you might hear them, boots in rhythm, voices in fog. The song of the lost, the ghosts of the battlefield, forever bound to the war that refused to end. Night had fallen again over the shattered fields of France. A pale fog rolled in from the north, creeping between the broken rifles and collapsed helmets, like a ghost reclaiming its ground. The once blood-soaked trenches were now a labyrinth of silence, save for the faint metallic tapping, as if someone or something was still working beneath the mud. The villagers of Courcelles had learned to avoid the old sector by night. They said the air there shimmered strangely, that sometimes the sound of marching boots could be heard in the fields, though no army had passed for decades. The mayor had fenced off the area after a shepherd's dog was found dead, eyes wide, body twisted as if frozen mid-scream. The locals whispered that he had barked at something invisible. And yet, for Dr. Martin Roux, the rumors were irresistible. Martin was a historian with the Ministry of Culture, assigned to catalogue forgotten World War relics. When he first read about Captain Laurent's unit disappearing near Hill 44 in 1916, a full company swallowed by fog with no survivors, he felt an unexplainable pull. There were records, but they ended abruptly, as if history itself had chosen to erase them. He thought it was an administrative error. He would soon learn it was something else entirely. Martin arrived on a rain-heavy afternoon, accompanied by a young soldier assigned as his escort, Private Elodie Marchand. She was quiet, disciplined, and skeptical of ghost stories, though her eyes flickered every time thunder rolled through the ruins. They set up camp near what was once a communications post, its structure half buried under moss and earth. As they unpacked, Elodie pointed toward a twisted metal pole. "See that?" she said. "That's where the field telegraph used to be. They say during the war it kept ringing, long after the operators died." Martin smiled faintly. "Echoes, perhaps. Metal retains vibration under certain weather conditions." But that night, as he lay awake with rain drumming against his tent, he thought he heard something else, a faint clicking, rhythmic coming from outside. Morse code. He crawled out with a lantern, scanning the mud. Nothing moved. But when he approached the rusted telegraph post, his light flickered. The tapping grew louder, clearer. SOS, the code of the dying. He leaned closer, breath shallow. The key on the broken telegraph was moving. Not fast, not slow, as if guided by a trembling hand. And just before it stopped, the line spelled one final word: Laurent. The next morning, Martin inspected the area. He found a corroded dog tag half buried in the mud near the post. The name was nearly erased by rust, but one word remained legible: Laurent. Elodie frowned. "You're not thinking this is him, are you? The missing captain?" Martin didn't answer. He kept brushing the tag clean with his thumb, feeling the ridges like braille. "History remembers what we choose to record," he muttered. But sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. As they dug deeper into the site, they uncovered shattered helmets, torn uniforms, and bones. Too many bones. But the strangest discovery was an iron box, sealed tight and marked with the French flag insignia. Inside were soaked documents and a photograph of a company of soldiers posing before a trench. In the center stood a man with calm, piercing eyes, Captain Laurent. But what chilled Martin was the figure standing directly behind him. It was the same face, the same uniform, duplicated like a ghostly reflection. That night, Elodie dreamed she was in the trench again. The sky flashed red, the world shaking under bombardment. She heard shouting, boots running through mud. When she turned, she saw Captain Laurent. Only his face was burned, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He reached out to her, whispering through blood-caked lips, "Find us." She woke up gasping, hands covered in dirt that hadn't been there when she slept. Martin found her sitting outside at dawn, trembling. "They're still here," she whispered. "They're waiting for something." He nodded slowly. "I think they want to be found or remembered." Together they decided to reopen the trench network, carefully marking every collapsed section. As they worked, strange patterns emerged. Trenches forming a symbol visible only from above, resembling a spiral or vortex. It wasn't standard military layout. It was deliberate. When Martin checked the wartime blueprints, the original maps didn't match. Someone had altered the terrain before the battle, as if drawing something into the earth. By sunset, fog began to rise again, thicker than before. Elodie's voice trembled. "We shouldn't stay." The villagers said, but before she could finish, a faint trumpet call echoed across the valley. A military signal, the call to advance. Martin froze. That's from 1916. The fog moved like a living thing, swallowing the horizon. From within it, figures began to form. Hundreds of soldiers marching in silence, their boots not touching the ground, their eyes hollow and white. They weren't attacking. They were retracing their steps. Each face blurred between life and death, uniforms half decayed, rifles rusted. One figure stopped in front of Martin, saluting. It was Laurent. The captain's voice was distant, warped like sound underwater. "You found us." Martin's hand shook. "What happened to you?" Laurent looked past him, toward the ground they stood on. The order was wrong. The map was wrong. We were sent into our own artillery fire. The earth took us and wouldn't let go. Then, one by one, the soldiers began to kneel, dissolving into mist until only Laurent remained. He handed Martin a small mud-stained notebook, his journal. "Remember us," he said softly, "not as ghosts, as men who waited to come home." When the fog cleared, Martin stood alone. The telegraph was silent. Elodie knelt beside a patch of disturbed soil, where she'd found another tag marked Marchand. Her breath caught. "That's my name." Martin stared at her in disbelief. "Your family." "My great-grandfather," she whispered. "He served here." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Martin opened Laurent's journal. Inside were sketches of trenches, lists of names, and a final entry written in shaking ink. "If the world forgets us, the ground will not. The dead remember." Thunder rolled again, deep and hollow. Somewhere in the valley, the faint echo of a bugle rose and faded into the night. Elodie whispered almost to herself, "Maybe some wars never end." Martin closed the book. "No," he said softly. "They just wait for someone to listen." And as the last light of dusk bled across the ruins, the fog began to stir again, carrying with it the faint murmur of men still marching, still calling out through time. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell like a curtain between worlds, the living and the dead. The valley of Courcelles, once a quiet scar in the countryside, was now a swamp of memories. Mud bubbled where bones slept, and every gust of wind seemed to whisper the same word: remember. Dr. Martin Roux sat in the tent, the old journal of Captain Laurent open before him. The ink had bled with age, but the words still carried the weight of desperation. Each line felt like a heartbeat buried in the pages. Across from him, Elodie sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the small dog tag that bore her family name. She hadn't spoken in hours. Finally, she broke the silence. "Martin, when you saw him, Captain Laurent, did he look alive?" Martin hesitated. Alive isn't the word. It was like looking at something caught between memory and shadow. He was aware, yes, but not... "Here." Elodie nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "Then maybe they're not ghosts. Maybe they're trapped." Outside, thunder groaned. That night, Martin read further into Laurent's journal. Near the end, one page had been torn out, leaving only a few fragmented sentences on the next. The order came from headquarters. Map altered by unknown hand. Command post silenced. It wasn't just bad luck or a miscommunication. Someone had deliberately sent Laurent's company to die. Martin leaned closer to the page, the lantern's flame trembling. "This wasn't an accident," he murmured. "Someone wanted them erased." At that moment, a faint sound cut through the tent, a scratching noise like metal against fabric. Elodie reached for her rifle. "Rats?" she whispered. But Martin shook his head. "No. Listen." The sound came again, steady and deliberate. It wasn't random. It was Morse code. The same rhythmic tapping he'd heard before. They froze, listening. It spelled out a single name. Roux. Martin's blood ran cold. At dawn, the fog returned, heavier, thicker, and somehow alive. The world outside the tent seemed blurred, like a half-developed photograph. Elodie stepped out first, her boots sinking into wet earth. The landscape had changed overnight. Where the old telegraph post had stood, there was now a shallow trench and freshly dug. Martin joined her, staring in disbelief. "We didn't do this." "No," she said. "They did." Inside the trench, they found rusted helmets and shattered rifles arranged neatly in a circle. At the center, someone had placed Laurent's photograph, the one from the iron box, but now it was burned around the edges, leaving only the captain's eyes visible. Martin knelt beside it. It's like they're trying to communicate, to guide us somewhere. Elodie pointed toward the woods. Then we follow. The forest beyond the battlefield was dense and still, as if holding its breath. Every branch dripped with rain. Every step sank deeper into the past. After nearly an hour, they reached a hill crowned with blackened trees. There, half buried under moss, stood a structure, a concrete bunker, sealed shut with rusted metal doors. Martin brushed away mud and read the faded inscription, Poste de Commandement, 1916. The command post, the one mentioned in Laurent's journal. Elodie forced the door open with a crowbar, and the smell of decay rushed out, a century of trapped air. Inside, the floor was littered with papers, shattered bottles and the skeletons of old typewriters. The walls were black with soot, as if burned from within. Martin picked up a telegram from the floor, its words still legible beneath a film of grime. Operation Mistfall. Proceed as planned. Sector 44 will be erased. He froze. Erased. Elodie frowned. They meant... Destroyed. Martin's voice was tight. No, erased from record. From history. They used their own men to cover something. Maybe a weapon or an experiment. As they moved deeper inside, they found a small metal cabinet bolted to the wall. Martin forced it open and found the missing journal page. It read, Command ordered us to advance into the fog. Men reported voices, whispers from ahead. They saw figures wearing our own uniforms. The fog wasn't natural. It swallowed sound. When dawn came, we were gone. All of us. He looked at Elodie. It wasn't just gas. They created something. Something that kept the dead from leaving. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. The bunker walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though the air itself remembered the screams that had once filled it. A faint hum rose from the far end, like distant machinery still running. At the end of the corridor stood a sealed iron door marked with a warning in red. Do not open, for God's sake. Elodie's hand hovered near the latch. Whatever's behind this, maybe it's better left buried. Martin shook his head. The truth is already awake. He turned the wheel. The lock screeched open. A blast of cold air hit them. The room beyond was vast, filled with rusted tanks, broken glass cylinders, and walls lined with strange machinery. In the center stood a device shaped like a massive compass, its metal arms stretching toward the ceiling. The markings on it were a mix of scientific notations and something else, occult symbols. Martin stepped closer. This was built to manipulate magnetic fields, maybe to create fog or distort radio waves. But, Elodie interrupted, voice trembling. Martin, look! In one of the shattered glass chambers stood a shadow, not a reflection, a human shape, faintly glowing, flickering like a dying candle. Laurent. He looked younger, as if the war had just begun. His mouth moved silently before the sound reached them, delayed and distorted. You shouldn't be here. Martin's breath hitched. What did they do to you? Laurent's eyes flickered, his voice layered with echoes, hundreds of voices beneath his own. They wanted to speak to the dead. They wanted soldiers who would never die. Elodie's hand shook. They succeeded. Suddenly the lights of their lanterns began to pulse. The machinery groaned to life, gears grinding after a century of silence. The air grew thick with static, and one by one, shapes began to appear. Soldiers, medics, officers, all translucent, all trapped between existence and memory. Laurent turned toward the machine, his face twisting with pain. Destroy it before it remembers us forever. Martin grabbed a rusted crowbar and swung it against the device. Sparks flew. The fog roared through the bunker like a living storm. Elodie fired her rifle into the main chamber. The glass exploded, shards slicing through the mist. A deafening sound filled the air, the sound of thousands of whispers screaming in unison. Then silence. When the fog finally cleared, the room was empty. The machine was gone. The floor was wet with condensation and blood. Elodie leaned against the wall, gasping. What happened? Martin looked at his hands. They were shaking, stained with ash. I think we set them free. But as they stepped out of the bunker, dawn was breaking, and the valley below was gone. In its place lay a vast plain, untouched by war, stretching endlessly into mist. Elodie whispered, Where are we? Martin looked around, the wind carrying faint voices, Marching, distant gunfire, a bugle's cry. I don't think we're in the present anymore. From the fog, figures emerged, men in 1916 uniforms, alive, shouting orders, preparing for battle. None of them saw Martin or Elodie. History had swallowed them whole. Martin's voice cracked. We've crossed into their memory. Into the day they died. Elodie's eyes widened. Then if this is their past, we might be able to stop it. He looked toward the horizon, where the first artillery flashes lit the sky. The same doomed advance, the same fog rolling in. Martin clenched his fists. If they were erased to hide the truth, then maybe we can rewrite it. They began moving toward the battlefield, knowing that somewhere in that endless grey mist, history was waiting to repeat itself, and this time the ghosts would not be alone. The world was grey, the air thick with ash and sorrow. Martin Roux blinked against the cold wind that cut through his coat, realizing with a jolt that the world around him had changed. No ruins, no moss-covered trenches. Everything was alive again, the battlefield reborn in its final, terrible hour. He stood on a ridge overlooking the French front line. Below, soldiers scrambled to prepare artillery, shouting over the distant thunder of war. Their faces were young, determined, terrified. Among them, he recognized one man immediately. Captain Laurent, alive, shouting commands as his men fixed bayonets. Elodie stood beside Martin, pale as the fog. We're inside the day they died. Martin's voice trembled. If we can stop it, if we can keep them from marching into the fog, and maybe the curse ends. A whistle blew. The sound split the air like a scream, and the men began to move. They ran down the hill, dodging explosions that sent mud and shrapnel raining from the sky. Machine guns rattled in the distance. The smell of sulphur and smoke clung to everything. Martin shouted over the chaos, "Laurent, stop your men!" The captain turned sharply, stunned to see two strangers running through the chaos. "Who are you?" he demanded. "This sector is sealed." Martin grabbed his arm. "You can't advance. The map is wrong. It's a trap." Laurent's expression hardened. "We've received orders." "From headquarters?" Martin interrupted. "Those orders were forged. The coordinates lead straight into friendly artillery fire. Your men will die, Captain. Every one of them." Laurent stared at him, disbelief warring with duty. Behind him, his soldiers waited, young faces trembling beneath their helmets. Elodie stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Please, my great-grandfather was one of them. You can still save them." For a moment the captain's eyes softened. Then the ground trembled, and a shell exploded just meters away. The shockwave threw them to the ground. When the smoke cleared, half of Laurent's platoon was gone. The fog began to crawl across the battlefield, a pale, shifting wall that devoured light and sound. The same fog that had swallowed Laurent's men a century ago. Martin coughed, pulling himself to his feet. "This is it. This is when it happened." Laurent looked out at the mist, his voice low. The orders were clear. Advance through the valley, capture Hill 44. Martin's voice rose desperately. "That's not fog, Captain. It's what they created. Something unnatural. It traps souls. Don't go in there!" But already the soldiers were disappearing into the mist, one by one, their shapes fading like ink bleeding into water. Laurent turned to him, anguish in his eyes. "If I disobey orders, they'll court-martial me. My men will be branded deserters." Martin grabbed him by the shoulders. "And if you follow them, they'll never be remembered at all." The captain hesitated. Then, with a grim nod, he raised his whistle and threw it into the mud. "Fall back!" he shouted. "We hold position." The soldiers froze. Confusion rippled through the line. Then a voice from the fog answered, cold, mechanical, and wrong. "Advance." Laurent stiffened. "That's my voice." Another order echoed. "Advance, soldiers of France. Forward." From the mist emerged ghostly silhouettes, perfect copies of Laurent's men, their faces pale, their movements jerky like broken marionettes. They carried rifles that gleamed with frost, eyes glowing faintly white. The real soldiers screamed. "They're us!" one shouted. "They're us!" The battlefield became a mirror, living and dead colliding in chaos. Laurent drew his pistol. "Get your people back!" he ordered Martin and Elodie. "Whatever that thing is, it feeds on fear. Don't let it take you." But Martin wasn't leaving. If this is a loop, if this is what traps them, then we have to break it from inside. Elodie pointed toward the far ridge, where the fog seemed to pulse around a flickering machine, the same compass-shaped device they had seen in the bunker, glowing as if feeding off the dying. "That's the source," she shouted. "If we destroy it here, maybe it never gets built in the first place." Martin nodded. "Then we finish it." They sprinted through the chaos, bullets whistling past, ghostly shapes clawing at their coats. The fog thickened, whispering in voices that weren't human. "Stay. Remember us. Stay." Elodie stumbled, hands covering her ears. "Martin, they're in my head!" He grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. "Don't listen. They want us to forget who we are." They reached the ridge. The machine stood before them, metal, wires and runes carved into steel, powered by something beyond science. At its base lay bodies, engineers and officers frozen mid-scream, their faces half fused with the metal. Martin picked up a rifle. "We end this the way it began." Laurent appeared behind them, blood streaking his face. "You were right," he said hoarsely. "This isn't a war. It's a grave repeating itself." Elodie looked at him. "Help us stop it." He nodded once and raised his pistol. Together they fired. The machine howled, a deep mechanical scream that shattered the fog. Light exploded outward, tearing through the battlefield. The ground cracked open, swallowing the trenches and the dead. For a brief blinding moment Martin saw them, thousands of soldiers standing at peace, no longer twisted in agony. Their faces calm, their eyes finally closing. Laurent turned to him, a faint smile on his lips. "Tell them we were real." Then he faded, dissolving into dust carried by the wind. When Martin woke, the sky was blue. Birds sang. The valley of Courcelles was quiet again. No ruins, no fog, no trace of war. Elodie lay beside him, breathing weakly but alive. He sat up, staring at the horizon. The landscape had changed. Wildflowers covered the fields and sunlight danced over the grass where trenches once cut through the earth. Elodie stirred. "Did we make it back?" He nodded slowly. "I think we made it forward." They walked toward the village. There were no signs of soldiers, no relics, no scars. But when they passed the old memorial stone, Martin stopped. The names engraved there, the lost company of Hill 44, now included two more: Captain Henri Laurent, Private Émile Marchand, and one newly carved name. At the very bottom, Dr. Martin Roux. Elodie froze. "That's you." He stared at it, heart pounding. Maybe history doesn't forget. Maybe it just rewrites. As they turned to leave, a breeze swept through the valley, carrying the faintest sound, a bugle call, distant but clear, echoing from somewhere beyond time. The ghosts were gone, the battlefield was silent, and the war had finally ended. Some stories end in silence, but the echo of their courage never fades.